It is a truth universally acknowledged that a costumer in search of a historical silhouette must be in want of the proper undergarments. Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lydia, the Halfling Seamstress, and today I'm tackling a project that is rather out of my comfort zone for more reasons than one. And that is a set of Regency short stays. For those unfamiliar with the term, in an extremely small nutshell, stays are essentially the precursor to corsets. They first originated in the 1700s, but the shape, silhouette, and level of boning inside changed from era to era. In the Regency era, they were fairly lightly boned, and you had two main styles: the long stays, which extended down to the hips with a wooden busk down the middle of the front, and the less popular short stays, which look very similar to the modern bra. Since this video is about construction and not a deep dive into history, if you want to learn more about the history of these undergarments, I've put a link below to Abby Cox's much more detailed look at the history of stays and corsets. So the first reason this project is out of my comfort zone: I have never made a structured / boned garment before. This is 100% a learning journey for me, and you're welcome to follow along and learn from what I did, but this is not meant to be a tutorial in any way, shape, or form. So let's get into the construction. I used Red Threaded's Regency short stays pattern, which comes with detailed step-by-step instructions. When I went to source my materials, I was having trouble finding coutil and boning that would ship to Canada during all of 2020's fun stuff for not an obscenely expensive cost. And it was about the time that I was banging my head against the wall wondering how I was going to find what I needed when Red Threaded's kits came back into stock. These kits are a great deal, and mine came with the fabric, lacing ribbon, drawstring ribbon, boning channels, and grommets needed to complete the project. I will confess there are a couple places I deviated from the pattern, so I didn't end up using entirely everything here, but I am so glad I bought the kit. So first off, a mock-up is essential. I made my first mock-up with the pattern completely as is, no alterations. This gave me a solid idea of what needed to be changed. And it was about this point in the process that the project came to a screeching halt. The mock-up fit remarkably well right out of the gate, and I could tell it only needed minor alterations to make it fit just right. The issue was in my head. Which brings us to reason number 2 about why this project was out of my comfort zone. As a kid, I was the skinny mini pixie, the teeny tiny flower fairy, the girl who loved playing hide and seek because she could always hide in the most obscure places that no one else could fit into. And then puberty hit, and I became, shall we say, well endowed. And that led to a lot of insecurity about the way I look. For most of my adult life, I've tried to dress to minimize that particular part of my body, to draw attention away from there, since it makes me feel really awkward. There are days when I look in the mirror and go, oh my gosh, my torso is 2/3 boob, and I hate it. And I know there are women out there who would kill for what I got, but me? Not a fan. So the issue here is that I've spent the last 13 or so years showing minimal cleavage and avoiding push-up bras like the plague, and the Regency silhouette is all about the lift, holding them girls up like a little shelf, and cleavage is in. So when I made my first mock-up and saw how close I was to the proper historical silhouette, I suddenly became really self-conscious and actually debated scrapping this project altogether. But aside from having spent the money on the pattern and the kit, I obviously decided to carry on with the project, make the necessary tweaks into the pattern, and complete it. First of all, to say that I could do it. I could hand sew a pair of Regency stays. Second of all, if I liked it, I would have a good base layer for a historically accurate Regency gown down the road. And thirdly, even if I finished the project and wore it and decided that ultimately I didn't feel comfortable in it and wouldn't wear it again, it still would be a learning experience. I would grow as a seamstress, I would improve my hand sewing skills, it would be my first boned garment, and the history geek in me still loved the idea of getting a better insight into the everyday life in the Regency era. So after plenty of philosophizing about insecurity, I made the second mock-up with the changes, liked the changes, and proceeded ahead to make the actual stays. Since precise measurements is key to a good boned garment, I cut all the pieces out flat instead of doubling the fabric up. And because pinning fabric can warp it ever so slightly, I instead weighed the pattern down with my favorite ink bottles. I marked the boning lines using the pattern, folding back to each line and marking along. Despite the front pattern piece being halved, I was reluctant to double the fabric since I wanted everything to be as precise as I could. So I first cut out the muslin lining piece and then laid it flat to mark out the coutil. I did go back to the paper pattern for marking out the gussets though, as it let me fold back to the markings and mark straight lines without having to figure out much measuring. Then I decided to try out my new rotary cutter for cutting out all the pieces. This pattern's default is unlined, but it does give some options and tips for if you do want to make it lined. I did decide to line my stays since I wanted to experiment with cording, and you can't really do that with a single layer. I just used some muslin cabbage from my stash and it worked out really well. To keep things simple, I flatlined the fabrics, first pinning them together and then basting them, so that when I stitched the pieces together, the coutil and muslin would be treated as one single layer of fabric. I also used pad stitches to baste up the middle of the pieces too, just to make sure everything stayed in place. The first step to making the gussets was to stay stitch along the seam line. This helps hold everything in place once it's cut, and gave an easy guide of where to fold over when the gusset material is being pinned in place. Then I pressed the front just to make sure everything was nice and flat. And then it was time for the nerve-wracking part, cutting open the gussets. This takes a precise hand as you need to cut right down the middle of each set of stay stitches and then go to the very end of the point. Then the narrow edges get folded back and pressed down. The gusset pieces then get pinned to the back of the stays, right side facing up. It's rather finicky matching up the bottom point of the gussets to the bottom point of gusset split, but I just played with it a bit and eventually got it all to sit nicely. And then I just repeated that 3 more times. It blew me away with how much shape it got just by pinning the gussets in, and I hadn't even gotten to sewing or boning yet. And then it was time to sew the gussets in. For security, I backstitched them all, and because I was sewing through 3 layers of coutil and muslin, it was an ordeal. I couldn't just do a straightforward and quick backstitch, I had to make each and every stitch one at a time. There were times when it definitely felt like I was fighting with a stubborn needle rather than actually sewing, and each gusset half took me 30 to 40 minutes to sew, which means those 4 gussets alone took me about 4 to 5 solid hours of hand sewing. At long last, the gussets were sewn in, and it was time to move on to structure. While full-length stays had wooden busks down the center, short stays usually had little to no busk. I decided to add some light boning to help with the whole ample bosom situation. I also wanted to try my hand at a little bit of cording. This was a common method of adding light structure without putting actual boning in. I started by marking 1.5 inches from the bottom of the stays, and then making 3 more lines, each a 1/4 inch further down. First, I backstitched the center boning channels, and it was such a relief to be able to do a standard backstitch for this. Then it was time to pivot and tackle the cording channels. Securing it to a pillow, or realistically the leg of my jeans, gave it a really nice smooth tension and sped up the stitching quite a bit. So the front piece of these stays definitely took the longest out of any single part of this project. The gussets took a good 4 to 5 hours, the channels took several hours of their own, and then I had to take a break of several days off sewing because I literally threw my neck out sewing gussets and boning channels. Turns out that when you're binge watching Farscape while hand sewing and going next episode, next episode, next episode because you're on a roll, you end up realizing you've been sewing like this for 2 hours, and your neck muscles absolutely hate you. I took 2 days off sewing, ended up seeing my chiropractor to loosen my muscles and get my neck back into alignment, and then took another 2 days off just to make sure everything stayed happy. So do as I say and not as I do. If you're hand sewing, take lots of breaks and watch your posture. Now back to sewing. The side panels also get a boning channel sewn in. If these stays were single layered, I'd be attaching external boning channels, but since it's lined, I made my own. The back panels get folded over and pinned down. There are 2 sets of bones at the back, and the lacing eyelets will go in between them. Because this is another place where the fabric is doubled, it's another place where all the back stitches have to be done one single step at a time. Once all the channels were stitched down, I folded under the raw edge. This isn't a channel, but I didn't want to leave the raw edge loose. And then I felled the fold securely down. Then I went back to the gussets and trimmed the coutil seam allowance by half before felling the raw muslin edges down, which I somehow didn't manage to get footage of. I also trimmed off the little bit of the gusset that ended up peeking up past the top, which the instructions say can happen. I didn't have much in the way of cord that was big enough, so I braided some crochet thread into the length I needed and hoped for the best. Using a tapestry needle, I threaded the cording through the channels. This was not as hard as I've seen in some videos, and it was actually really fun. I bet if the channels were narrower though, it might have been a bit more of a challenge. And then I used this lovely off-white silk thread from Devere Yarns to help secure the bottom of the gussets, and also to hide the few little sticky outy bits that didn't quite get tucked in all the way. It took a bit more fighting to get this section done, and I can see why some people use pliers when sewing stays. I did find it a bit easier when I used my leather thimble for a bit of friction, but even that didn't work 100% of the time. Finally, the front piece was complete, and it was time to move on to assembly, and the side pieces got attached to the front piece first. Now, for assembly, I had originally bought this thick, strong-looking linen thread, thinking, thick thread, strong seams. However, when I actually tried sewing with it, it wouldn't go through the coutil. So instead, I opted for my go-to linen thread. The one advantage I did find with having to make each step of my back stitch separately was that my stitches seemed to end up much more uniform and tiny than when I just scoot along doing regular back stitches. Once the side panels were sewn on, I attached the back panels and back stitched them down. Pretty much everything in this project was done with either a back stitch or a whip stitch. Then I pressed all my seams open because it was time for boning channels. The seam at the back only gets one boning channel, but I did fold the other seam allowance in as well to prevent fraying. Now, the kit I bought comes with boning, but since I made a couple of alterations to the original pattern, including making it slightly longer, all the cute little bones that came in the kit were now too short for my stays. I had heard about synthetic baleen, which is essentially just plastic boning, but I also heard that if you don't want to shell out the cash for synthetic baleen, in a pinch, you can use industrial weight zip ties. So that's what I did. I found a big bag at my local surplus store and they worked impressively. I'm not saying I want to try boning a Victorian corset with them, but I can definitely see some more project ideas down the road for them. I made sure to mark the boning width on the seam allowances so I knew how far to fold in. There was one seam that, try as I might, I could not get to fold under nicely, and I was worried about it coming undone with wear. Thankfully, the kit came with a strip of pre-made boning channel, and I decided to use that instead. I trimmed the seam allowance, and then did a quick whip stitch along the edges to hold them down. Then I pinned in the boning channels. To make the rest of the boning channels, I folded the seam allowances under, and they all get felled down with little whip stitches, being careful to only catch the lining and not the outer fabric. Before I put the bones in, I got my edge binding ready. This is the one thing that the kit does not come with, and while I originally planned to use some leftover coutil, after I had been sewing with it for a while, I realized it would not make the best binding. So I went with a bit of cotton broadcloth instead. A lot of corsets are bound with bias binding, but historically, some corsets and stays could be bound with straight grain fabric instead. I tried being fancy and drawing threads, but gave it up after the first row. The weave was light enough that I could see through to the measurement markings on my cutting mat, and that was way easier. I pinned the binding to the bottom edge on the right side, and then I backstitched it into place. I trimmed down the bottom seam allowance ever so slightly, folded the binding in and over, and then whipped it down on the wrong side. Once the bottom was bound, I was ready to put the boning in. I still had a number of boning pieces from my mock-ups, and they only needed a bit of care to make them ready. First I measured out which ones would fit where. Once I had my bones picked out, I trimmed them to fit, and then filed the edges so they wouldn't be sharp and pokey. I tried using a craft sanding block and a glass nail file, but it was actually a cheap dollar store emery board that ended up working the best. That said, if the weather was nicer, I totally would have taken them outside and used my Dremel, and it would have been done in half the time. And then I worked my way across the stays, fitting in the bones. I love how they look when they're snugly fit inside their channels. It's so satisfying. After the bones were in place, I pinned on the top binding in the same way as the bottom binding, except for a lot more pins. And more backstitching for the binding. At the center, I took care to leave a tiny gap to allow for the drawstring to pass through. I turned the binding to the wrong side and pinned almost all the way around, but paused at the front side seam. I cut the drawstring ribbon and pinned it to the seam, then it got securely stitched down. With the drawstring secure, I went back to pinning the binding in place, taking care to tuck the drawstring along the front edges. And then it was time for lots and lots of little felling stitches. When I reached the center front seam, I took extra care not to catch the drawstring in my felling, and every so often pulled lightly on it to make sure it was still drawing up properly. And at last it was time for eyelets. The kit came with grommets, but 1, I don't actually own a grommet setter, and 2, I kind of like the idea of hand sewing the eyelets myself. I marked 1/2 inch from the top of the binding, and then at 1.25 inch intervals. And then I made the holes with an awl. This way the fabric isn't cut and thereby weakened, but instead it's pushing the fibers apart. To bind the eyelets, I went back to my silk thread, first making a few base stitches to hold everything in place, and then I went around again to fill in the gaps. After I sewed in all the eyelets, and stabbed my finger for the 17 millionth time, the stays were ready to lace up. I used a pair of tapestry needles to thread the ribbon through, so that I could be sure it was lacing up even on both sides. Once the lacing was in, I tried it on so that I could mark the fit for the shoulder strap eyelets. On the strap, I marked 1/2 inch up from the binding edge, and then marked the spot on the body. Then these last 4 eyelets get made in the same way as the back lacing. I wanted the laces at the shoulders to be lightweight and easy to tuck away, so instead of using some of the back lacing, I picked out some narrow ribbon. I cut 2 24-inch ribbons, threaded them through the eyelets, and tied the ends together loosely to secure the ribbon while I'm putting it on. And with that, my Regency short stays are complete. I am so glad I pushed through my anxiety and doubts because I absolutely love these. They turned out so cute, so sweet, and they fit so well. Everything I was worried about in the mock-up stage ended up not being an issue once I was working with the lined coutil, and the drawstring is the perfect finishing touch to tie everything together. Pun intended. It's like wearing a happy little hug, which, as someone with sensory issues, I am loving it. And though them girls are higher up than I might usually like to keep them, the cording and the drawstring do a fantastic job of keeping them in their place and not feeling like they're going all over the place. So that was one heck of a project, and while I'm really glad I made it, I'm also kind of glad it's over. There were times when it felt like I wasn't sewing, and now I have an urge to make some really quick machine sewn projects just to get me back in the sewing groove. So, stay tuned for those. If you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to be sure to catch those next few quick projects, consider hitting the subscribe button, and I will see you all in my next video.